Let me share the screen. We'll read the nutshell. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Matot Masei in a nutshell. So if you notice, it's two parshas. It's the final two portions of the fourth book of the Torah. The name of the parsha, Matot, means tribes, and is found in Numbers chapter 32, chapter 30, verse 2. The name of the parsha, Masei, means journeys, and is found in Numbers chapter 33. Okay, Moses conveys the laws governing the annulment of vows to the heads of the tribes of Israel. So that there's this law. You can make a vow, and in Judaism, words you speak are very important. And if you say something, it's a commitment, and you have to keep it, and it's a great sin to violate and not keep your word. However, there's a mechanism which you could nullify the vow. And we actually do something like that on Yom Kippur, on Kol Nidre, where we say all the vows that we take should be nullified. We could talk a lot about that. We could talk about the technical aspect of that. We can also talk about the mystical and spiritual and psychological aspect of that. So put that in your notes. Maybe hopefully we'll get back to that. Okay. War is waged against Midian for their role in plotting the moral destruction of Israel. And the Torah gives a detailed account of the war spoils and how they were allocated amongst the people, the warriors, the Levites, and the high priests. Here it's just 3 lines, and the Torah takes a tremendous amount of space. The exact amount of the spoils, how it was divided, seems like it's excessive, the detail, but that's for that. Then we go to another story. This is a fascinating story. This next story is the tribes of Reuven and Gad, 2 tribes, later joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh, asked for the lands east of the Jordan as their portion in the promised land, these being prime pasture land for their cattle. So what happens is, we read in the last week, we read a few weeks ago that the Jewish people at this point conquered a tremendous amount of land east of the Jordan, in what is today Jordan and probably Syria. And it wasn't part of the promised land to Abraham. So at some point, it was just supposed to be sitting empty. And now 2 tribes approach Moshe and say, we have a tremendous amount of cattle. And these lands east of the Jordan are perfect for pasture. Maybe they're not perfect for agriculture, but we're not that interested in agriculture. We are interested in raising animals. So we want lands of pasture. Moses is initially angered by this request. Moshe is frightened, actually. He's traumatized. He thinks we have a replay of the story of the spies, which was when the Jewish people were afraid to enter the land of Israel and said, we don't want to go into Israel. And that delayed the entry into the land for 40 years. And Moshe says, oops, we're having a replay of this terrible tragedy. So Moshe initially is what's the true? They use angered, but angered is maybe too light of a word, outraged. But subsequently agrees on the condition that they first join and lead in Israel's conquest of the lands west of the Jordan. In other words, if these tribes, they will go to battle to conquer the land east of the Jordan. West of the Jordan, in Israel proper. And if they'll be they'll lead the army, they'll lead the troops. That means they're not afraid to conquer. If they do so, then they're going to get the land east of the Jordan as the deal was decided. That's the first parsha that we read today, Matot. And finally, we get to the last parsha. The 42 journeys and encampments of Israel are listed, from the Exodus to their encampment on the plains of Moab across the river from the land of Canaan. So the Torah relists Eila Masei. Masei means journeys. These are the journeys of the Jewish people, and it lists every single stop. 40 years, we have 42 stops from Egypt till the bank of the Jordan River opposite the city of Jericho. The boundaries of the promised land are given. The cities of refuge are designated as havens and places of exile for inadvertent murderers. Seems like a small idea, but again, if it's placed here, it's significant. And finally, we read about the daughters of Tzalafchad married within their own tribe of Manasseh, so that the estate which they inherit from their father should not pass to the province of another tribe. This, again, seems like a technical issue that we have to deal with, but it's the final episode in the 4th book of the Torah. You have to say there's deeper here than just a technical issue. So I'm just going to run through the technical issue, and then we could talk about the significance. The technical issue is as follows. We read last week's parsha. We read that up to that point, only sons inherited real estate. And here you had 5 daughters who were the sons of a man. Slavchad died, he had no sons. They come to Moshe and they say, we want our father's portion. Moshe says, okay, let's ask Hashem. God says, yes, that's the law. Give them the land. Now, the problem now is the other tribes complain. What do they complain? What's so bad if women get land? What's so terrible? It's the end of the world. So the tribes say like this. The problem is like this. If these women who inherit land are now going to marry outside the tribe, they're going to marry members of another tribe, then their children, the tribal lineage follows the father. So their children are going to be considered part of another tribe. So in other words, this land that was originally part of tribe A, the next generation will be transformed to tribe B. And that's going to sort of blur the lines of the tribal division of the land of Israel. So the Torah says, indeed, Moshe says they're right, and God says they're right, the other tribes are right. If a woman would inherit land, she should marry from her own tribe. Now, the commentaries explain that that was specific for that generation. Soon, when they enter the land of Israel, the division of the tribes has to be solid and complete. But in subsequent generations, it's okay for those women who inherit land to marry even people of other tribes, because there could be a certain blurring between the tribes that is okay and probably also positive and probably also desirable. So that's the technicality. That's the conclusion of the book. Like I said, if we get there, we could talk about how this is not just technical, this is significant to the message of the Torah, et cetera, et cetera. We have a lot to do. So if anyone has anything that any of these discussions triggered something, a thought, an idea, a question, please share so we know what to focus on. Otherwise, we'll start at the beginning, and I'm going to try to move through a few significant points. I also want to reserve 3-4 minutes at the end to talk about the final verses, because that is our custom. When we conclude the Torah, we make the celebration. So we want to read and think about the significance of the last verses of the book. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Okay. Just getting warmed up. Okay, so if we look at the list of topics that we started with, I'll share the screen right now again. And you look at the beginning of the parsha, the first thing we talked about was the laws governing the annulment of vows. Okay, annulment of vows. A vow is a person says, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to do it, whatever it is, takes a vow. And many times it's in the form of taking a vow, I'm never going to do something. And then at a certain point, you say, you know what? I changed my mind. You know what? I really want to start doing it. So you know what? Let me find the mechanism to undo the vow. Now it's very interesting. The written Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah, just talks about nullifying of a vow of a woman. So if a woman who makes a vow, if she's young and unmarried, if she's young, her father could annul the vow. If she's married under certain circumstances, her husband can annul the vow. That's all the Torah says. But the rabbis say, they derive from the verses, that actually any vow from any person could be annulled by the court. Doesn't say so explicitly in the Torah, but the rabbis derive that from a few words in this week's parsha. In fact, in the Mishnah, in Avot, in the tractate of the Ethics of the Fathers, it talks about this idea that it says, Heter nidarim porchim ba'avir. The nullifying of the vows literally is flying in the air, meaning there's almost no scriptural source for this, but this is the oral Torah. The oral Torah believes that the way we read, there's a verse that says a person should not annul their own vow. Should not violate their own vow. So we derive that you can nullify your vow, but the court could do it for you. And there's other supporting systems, but the bottom line is it's not written clearly in the Torah, but it's the rabbinic law. Okay, what is so important and what's so significant about nullifying the vows? Why is a vow a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Why is it placed exactly at this juncture in the Torah? We could talk about this for a long time. I'm going to try to remain brief. And the story is as follows. What is a vow? A vow is, the Torah tells me certain things that are prohibited or off limits. There are 365 prohibitions in the Torah. Okay. What happens if I feel that something that is kosher and totally fine from the Torah's perspective is damaging for me? So for whatever reason, for me, this behavior is damaging. This behavior, I'm indulging in this behavior to the extent that instead of me controlling it, it's controlling me, and it's bringing me down, and it's causing me to self-destruct. So stop doing it. Sometimes it's hard to stop doing it. So that's why there's the mechanism that says, I'm going to take a vow. And a vow is, I make a vow. When I make a vow, I know this is serious business. So that's an additional support for me to say that I'm never going to do this, right? Let's say I'm a person that if I, alcohol is an interesting example, even though alcohol is there's a similar form of a mechanism called a nazir, where a person says, I'm not going to drink wine. But Torah says wine is okay, nothing wrong with wine. But if it becomes excessive for you, it may become addictive. Then you have to separate yourself from it and do everything you can to separate yourself from it, because it's going to destroy you. But it's not just alcohol. It could be any other pleasure that a person engages in too much. Anything could become addictive. I don't know if anything, but without getting into the definition of addiction, but things could become destructive. And that's why we have a mechanism where I say, I'm making an oath, this is prohibited, this is off limits. And off limits with the force of a vow. And I know it's serious. You're not allowed to violate a vow. It's the only one of the 10 commandments that it says God will not forgive if somebody says God's name in vain, which means in the context of a vow, makes a vow with God's name and then violates it. So that's the proper approach. However, that's not the goal. The goal is not to say I'm going to separate from everything in this world. The goal is not to separate. The goal is to sanctify. So sometimes I first have to say no. I have to say I'm not engaging in this. This thing is off limits for me. And then when I say no, I become in control. And then when I come in control, I could later grow to the point where not only is this object not distracting for me, but I can actually use it to enhance my service of God, to sanctify it, right? But that's a stage of spiritual growth. And you have to first be the person who could say no. If you can't say no, then it's controlling you, right? It's very common that people who are, I don't want to use the word addicted, but people who are obsessive about a certain behavior, they say, I could stop whenever I want. And sometimes they could, oftentimes they can't. And the only way to know if I could stop whenever I want is if I actually practice stopping, right? So the point is for you to be in control, you have to say no, and if you say no, then you could say yes. So that's the mechanism here of the neder. Neder is, I say, for me at this point, even though the Torah says this is kosher, nothing wrong with eating this food. But if I engage, nothing wrong with eating chocolate cake. In fact, it can enhance your day. If you have a little bit of chocolate cake with your coffee in the morning, who knows how many mitzvot you can do. Yeah, but if I finish the entire platter of cake and I can't stop myself, then it's going to be destructive. Okay? So the question is, at some point, I could say, this is off limits for me. The goal, however, like I said, is not to say something is off limits, but to nullify the vow, undo the vow, which is basically raising me to a higher state of consciousness where I now am in control and I could elevate that object. So that's the mystical and spiritual idea of nullifying of the vow. Why is this so important at this juncture? And why are the Jewish people hearing about this at the conclusion of the fourth book when they are sitting at the bank of the Jordan River about to conquer the land of Israel? They are going to go into the land of Israel they're going to cross into the land of Israel literally in a month and a half, approximately a month and a half. Other Nisan, they're in 2.5 months. They're literally 2.5 months before they go into the land of Israel. All of a sudden, the Torah says, oh, I got to tell you this law about nullifying of the vows. So here's the big idea is as follows. The Jewish people, when they were in the desert, they were separate and removed from the temptations of the world. They were living in their own society. They were living not a society. They were living in the desert, which means there's no civilization, there's no temptation, there's no distraction, there's nothing going on. There's no civilization to pull them away from their own values. When they're going to go into the land of Israel, everything is going to change. Here, they're much more engaged in the physical world, in creating a civilization. And when you do so, there could be those things that will actually pull you away from spirituality. If you have to farm land, and you have to build a home, and you have to acquire wealth, and you have to be successful, and you have to raise an army, and you have to engage in foreign affairs, okay? So these are all activities that maybe pull you away from spirituality and sort of may impact your values in a negative way. So the Jewish people now are in a major state of transition from being in a state of being allowed to be separate from the world and creating your own spiritual haven to crossing the Jordan and engaging and elevating. And that's a big shift. So in some ways, they're moving from a state of vow to nullifying the vow. They're moving to a state where the world, potentially in the beginning, you have to be very careful to see that I could say no to this temptation. I could say no to materialism to make sure that I'm in control. It's not controlling me. But then I have to grow to the point where I say yes, and I cultivate and I elevate the physical object or the physical experience. And that is exactly what we're doing collectively as a people. And that's why it's important specifically at this stage, because at this stage is the transition from the state of separation from the world to the state of engaging in the world. In some ways, we do this every day. Because when you start your day, you're supposed to make a moment just for you and Hashem, separate from the rest of the world. You could pray. You could say the Shema. Say the Shema, in some sense, what you're doing is you're covering your eyes. There's no mitzvah to cover your eyes, but that becomes the custom. You're basically covering your eyes and saying, I'm separating myself from the physical phenomenon that my eyes tell me about, and I'm focusing on a deeper truth that sometimes you can't see, but you have to listen to. That's Shema, listen, hear, think about, think more abstractly. Don't look only at what your eyes tell you. Look for the soul, look for the holiness. So in some ways, I have a moment of separating, going inward, transcending, but then the rest of the day, I'm almost like, metaphorically speaking, nullifying the vow. Once I separate, I could engage because now I could elevate. And that's the story in short about the nullifying of the vows. And that's why it's so important, first of all, to place it exactly here in the historic transition from desert to civilization. And because that's what the Jewish people are going to be called upon to do. And it's also important in our life. We have moments of seclusion, moments of introspection, moments of realigning our values with spirituality, and that will that would require a temporary separation from the physical world, and that gives us the power to re-engage the physical world and ultimately elevate it to the point where it's not controlling me, I'm controlling it. It's not using me, I'm using it. Right? You talk about possessions. In a way, possessions possess you. In a way, you possess them. Right? Because in a way, I don't want to get into this right now, but there's the same word in Hebrew could be both. You can be possessing your possession, or your possession could be possessing you, because if you're worrying about it, now it's possessing you. It's holding you, it's controlling you. If you're using it for your benefit, but you know how to sort of turn off the worry and turn off the concern and turn off the excessive involvement, then you're controlling it. But sometimes for you to control it, you have to be able to say no, because if you can't say no, you're not controlling it. So that's the story in short about the vows. A lot more to say, but that's one big idea that we're going to think about in this parsha. Oh. Okay, we're going to turn back to the we're going to turn back to we're going to continue down the story, and we're going to talk about the idea of, I spoke a little bit about Sunday about this, so I don't want to redo this too much about Joseph being east of the Jordan, but maybe we'll get back to that in a minute. Let's go to the 42 journeys. The 42 journeys, we have 42 journeys that the Torah repeats to us and tells us, and says these are the 42 journeys which the Jewish people traveled from the land of Israel. And the obvious question is, why do we actually have to repeat all 42 journeys? Why can't we know that already? If you're actually interested to know which location the Jewish people camped in, if you're really curious, scroll back to the second book of the Torah, scroll back to the beginning, the middle of the fourth book of the Torah, and then you will know exactly why, which locations the Jewish people stayed at. And instead, the Torah goes into great detail, listing all 42, repeating really, all 42 places that the Jewish people camped. The question is how come? The question is what's the significance? I'm going to share the verse and the Rashi. I said this past year, so I'm going to try to be brief, but this is very important in my opinion. So this is the beginning of the second parsha called Masei, journeys. These are the journeys of the children of Israel who left the land of Egypt. in their legions under the charge of Moses and Aaron. And then later it talks about where they traveled. It says that they journeyed from, and they journeyed from Elam and camped in Red Sea. They journeyed from the Red Sea and camped in Desert of Sin. They journeyed from the Desert of Sin and camped in Dafka. They journeyed from Dafka and camped in Alush, etc., etc. So sometimes you have a few stories, but most of it is just a list of the 42 places. So Rashi asks the question: why were these journeys recorded? In other words, why do I have to repeat it? If you really, really want to know, like I said, you can turn back to book 2 and book 4, and you can track and you can find all these places. Why is this so important? So that Rashi gives his first answer, which we're not going to get into right now. We'll go to the second answer. The second answer, he says, is right here. I found the commentary of Rab Moshe Hadarshan, the preacher, in the Medrash Agada. In other words, Rashi says, I found another interpretation. So I'm bringing you the second interpretation. Rabbi Tanchuma expounds it in another way. In other words, Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, Rabbi Moshe the preacher, says, I found the Medrash from Rabbi Tanchuma. What does Rabbi Tanchuma says? It is analogous to a king whose son became sick. So he took him far away to a faraway place to have him healed. On the way back, the father began citing all the stages of their journey, saying to him, this is where we sat, here we were cold, here you had a headache, etc. Medrash Tanchuma. What is Rashi saying? Rashi says, why does the Torah repeat all of the journeys? So Rashi comes up with a nice story. And if you think about it, it's a cute story. But if you think about it, the story doesn't really explain anything and doesn't really answer the question. In fact, it makes the question bigger. But let's just start with the basic story. What does Rashi say? Imagine your child is sick. Not your child, God forbid. Imagine somebody's child is sick. So he takes the child from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast so they can come to the hospital in New York. And then on the way, there are all kinds of journeys. There's 42 stops. And every stop, something else happens. Now they're going home. And they're going home. And on the way home, the father tells his son, oh, you remember we were at this motel? You remember what happened here? You remember what we ate for dinner? And as he goes home, he repeats all of the events that happened. And this is supposed to be the interpretation that Rashi brings of how come the Torah mentions all the journeys once, but it's going to mention all the journeys again. Because why? Because the guy's going home. When you go home and you pass into the same locations, you're going to repeat what happened. That is the Rashi. Now, Rashi is very nice. Rashi, very nice story. We all like stories. But if you think about it for a little bit, it really actually, this doesn't make any sense at all. And this is the Rebbe's question. I'll give you the Rebbe's interpretation, which in my opinion is beautiful. The problem with this analogy is that this analogy does not fit what happened with the Jewish people in the desert. How come? I gave you an analogy, someone going from the West Coast to the East Coast. And then on the way home, they're traveling back. And when they travel back, they are going they're recounting the same places. And recounting the same places. And the father then therefore tells the son, remember what happened in this place and that place. The problem is that in our case, the Jewish people did not travel back. They traveled from Egypt to Israel. They took a few detours, they windy path, but they did not go back on that same path. Right? They never went back. They never revisited the old places. So why is Rashi telling me a story that we're repeating it? Because like the father takes the child to be healed. And then on the way home, when they're revisiting those places, he's actually recounting what happened if the Jewish people are not really revisiting those same places. They never went back. They just went one way. So we can get into the details and the specifics. I want to stay general. General idea is as follows. In a way, the Jewish people did revisit, even though not literally, but they did revisit those experiences internally. In other words, a person has a journey. And this is what the Hasidic masters write about. Shem Tov talked about this. All his students talk about this. Every person's life is a journey. And in a way, every person's life's journey has 42 steps, but let's not get into it. Every person's life is a journey. And the journey is advancing. You're moving forward. Even though it looks like there are setbacks, you're really moving forward. In the language of the Medrash, the Father, meaning God, is leading you down this journey to heal you. In other words, every step of this journey is for positivity and it's for growth. The problem is that the way we experience the journey as some of them as setbacks. And the Jewish people had tremendous setbacks in their 42-step journey. There was many sins and many setbacks. So when I'm looking at the journey from my perspective, when the child is looking at the journey from their perspective, we see some advancement and some setbacks. Okay. What is Rashi telling you? Rashi is telling you at the end of your journey, once you get to your destination, recount all those 42 steps, retell all those stories, because in some ways, what's happening is you have to revisit those stories and realize that all those stories were for healing. Meaning even those journeys, which to you seem like setbacks, were really here to advance and to heal you and to make you grow. And even if you couldn't see it at the time, because on the way there you had a headache, but on the way back, in other words, after you're healed, after you get your destination, you could turn back and revisit those stories. In modern psychology, they're going to call it reframe that experience. In other words, think about it from a different perspective. But here it's every single step of the journey of my life is for healing, is for positivity. Even the story even the experience that while I was in that experience, it was painful and it was difficult. And I felt disengaged from my true self, and I felt disconnected from God, and I felt disconnected from people I love. I don't see how this is healing. But once I reach my destination, once I climb out of that abyss, once I grow from that experience, now I realize that the challenge itself is part of the healing. And that's why Rashi says at the end of the journey, the Jewish people have to do this, but each of us have to do this. Go back and recount all 42 steps and realize that this is all a journey toward healing, toward positivity. Even those steps that at the time seemed not healing, they indeed become part of healing, because when you look back, you reframe, you regrow, you experience those experiences, and you take out the positive and the good. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
So my question is this, Rabbi. Do you and Vicky and Randy have to wait to be my age to do this?
No. In a way, yes. In a way, no. In a way, yes. In a way, no. In a way, there's something that when you have experience, you can look back at life, and you have the full picture. And when you see the full picture, many times it's much easier to see the positivity. You don't have to wait to be a certain age on the passport, but you do have to be out of the painful experience. That's the point. When you're in the painful experience, don't try to find something good in it. That's important. Someone's suffering, someone comes to you, or if you're suffering yourself, you don't say, you know what, let me stop the pain, let me look at the good. It's too painful, you're not going to see the good. You have to move forward, you have to try to grow, you have to try to heal. And don't say this was a wonderful experience. But that's what he says on the way back. On the way back means when I moved on from the negative experience. Sometimes that takes a half an hour, sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes a year, sometimes it takes a decade, sometimes it takes multiple decades till I pull myself out of this problem. But the point is, when I'm in the problem, when I'm suffering, I can't say this is healing. It's just simply not true. And it's also not accurate. And it's also a little bit of denial of how I feel. And at least in the subjective experience, this is not healing. And it's not going to help me to tell myself that this is positive. I could acknowledge the pain. There's nothing wrong with that. But when I go out of that situation, when I moved on, when the pain stopped, or when the pain was diminished, and I grow from that experience, which is which in many cases happens over time, then I could go back and see, that was positive. Now, when I'm in pain, I could know intellectually that I'm going to go through this process, that I will grow from this. But I shouldn't try to make myself feel that, because we're not on the way home yet. We're not on the way back, right? You have to wait for it to be on the way back. Go ahead, doctor.
Well, my question again, because I think this is incredibly relevant contemporarily to every one of our lives. If we've been wounded in some way by a sibling, by a parent, by an individual, and we're beyond that, is it really important to go back and reframe it and ask ourselves the following question? How could this possibly be for my benefit? And I understand psychologically that's a very effective strategy, but are you encouraged to do that so that ultimately every wound that you've had in the past that you're not currently dealing with, you can reframe and actually, in a way, almost thank the person for what you were resentful for before, because you can intellectually find some way to have found that particular action beneficial to you?
That's a very good question. I'm going to confess that I didn't ever really thought about Do you always have to do it? And what's the benefit? But I'm going to start from the intellectual perspective, and then we'll move to emotional. Theologically, this is important because a person believes that God places us in this world, God gives us opportunities, and God wants us to move forward. Like the name of the parsha is Masei journeys, and the Hasidic masters say, you're on a journey to move forward. So the question is, if I'm on a journey to move forward, how is it that God throws all those obstacles in my way? And that's a very deep problem that people, the theological problem that people have, and they say, how could God just pile on tsaros, right? The Yiddish word tsaros. How could God keep piling on difficulties in my life? And when you're in the pain, there's no answer to that question other than try to move forward. But the point is, when you finish the pain, you have to realize that God, in fact, is giving you opportunities for growth. He's not out to get you. And it's important to understand that even to have a healthy relationship with God, even to have a healthy relationship with my life story, right? Because I could look at my life story as I had 30 years of a disaster, and then I overcame it. Well, at least now I'll have a few decades of peace. That's good, but it's not wholesome. To be wholesome is that every part of the story is part of the plot. And I wouldn't be the person I am now without going through that difficulty. Now, you're asking me, is it always okay to go back? I would say don't do it without professional help, right? Because you have to make sure you were moved on, and you have to make sure you're healed before you can go back and say that negative situation was actually a blessing in disguise. You have to be in a very safe and stable place. Go ahead.
The ultimate question, which I'm sure Randy and Vicky have thought about as well, as you're bringing this to my attention, is that the Rebbe or others who lived through the Holocaust ultimately get to that elevated point where they could see that was for their benefit?
Not necessarily, because not necessarily have we been healed. You see what I'm saying? You have to move on. Some things you can't move on from. Some things you just have to, you're not, in other words, the point here is, in my life, I have to see that this experience helped me journey forward. It made me a stronger person. That you can get to. If you want to talk about collectively, the suffering in this world, how that's going to bring the world forward, sometimes we don't see that. And sometimes we're not really healed. We're not really on the way back yet. But the belief is, and I'll tell you what the Rebbe wrote, the Rebbe quoted this, but it's actually in the prophets. The belief is that once Mashiach comes, once the world reaches perfection, we're going to look back, and this is a very strange verse from Isaiah. I'm going to thank you, God, for afflicting me. In other words, when the world reaches perfection, we're going to realize that the difficulties in this world are actually what propelled humanity forward. And today we don't see it because today we're not on the way back. So I would say in my life, I could get to the point where I am who I am because of these experiences. And if you take away the challenges in my life, you would also have to take away the blessings and the growth that I achieved. But collectively, we believe that. I don't know if we always see it, because I think we'll have to get to the point where we have been healed. But once we've been healed, we're going to the belief is we're going to turn back and say, yes, the suffering in this world was actually a way to help humanity grow. Do I experience it this way now? Absolutely not. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. That was very deep thought, and I just want to comment on Doctor's question that I did experience myself the importance of going back to those experiences and thank certain people. Of course, not on a global scale, absolutely not, but in personal experience, some Hasidic masters recommend it as a necessary step. Go back when you healed and try to go through those steps and thank Hashem for that experience without like relieving the responsible party of responsibility.
Right.
But that's some Hasidic masters recommend that as a necessary step, and it's very helpful.
Okay, here you have a real life example. I'm just talking from theoretical, but Vicky is someone who practices the Hasidic way of life, so it's bringing it down to the real world. Okay, I want to go because 11:01. I want to just do one more minute. Those who have to go are welcome to go. I want to do one more minute to read the last verse of this parsha of the book. Say chazak, chazak, which is what we customarily say when we finish a book. Be strong, and may we be strengthened. And I'm going to maybe say one idea, especially in honor of Vicky, who just finished the Shiva of her father, and maybe you can relate to. Maybe it's related. So I'm just going to read verse 13. These are the commandments and the ordinances that the Lord commanded the children of Israel through Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and may we be strengthened. So I'm going to give you a little commentary here from a 16th century, 16th century Kabbalist in Sfat. He wrote a book. He wrote a book called Siftei Kohen, and he was a Kabbalist. He was a student of the Arizal, and he wrote a book, and his commentary on these words are as follows. Arvot Moab, literally plains of Moab. Just a place. It's just a place. It's the plains of Moab. It's opposite the Jordan River. He says Arvot Moab. So Arvot means plains, but Arvot comes from the word Arev, guarantor. And you could read this, Moab is obviously from the father. That's actually the name why the Moab was called. If you remember the story in Genesis, the daughters of Lot thought the whole world was dead, and so they had children with their father, and the older one named her son Moab from father. So this basically could be read. These are the commandments that God gave to Moshe and to the children of Israel, the guarantors of their father. And what the Siftei Kohen says, he says like this. He says, you read the fourth book of the Torah and you look at the history of the Jewish people in the desert, the 40 years, you could look at it as disappointment and you could look at it as failure, because the generation that left Egypt, in fact, rejected the land of Israel, and in fact did not make it into the land of Israel. So you would finish the fourth book and say it's actually a little bit depressing for that generation. However, says the Siftei Kohen, he says what the Torah is alluding to is the fact that the children grow from that experience, and the fact that the children move forward, and the fact that the children move into the land of Israel, are about to go into the land of Israel, that actually they are guarantors for the parents' legacy. So they are actually elevating anything that the parents could not do in their own lifetime. The children are able to elevate and advance, and that brings joy and that brings fulfillment to the souls of the parents in heaven as well. So I thought that's a very beautiful a beautiful commentary about that generation. But of course, it's about our generations as well, that we are able to bring wholesomeness and completion and a fulfillment and closure to the previous generations as well. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbat.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. I do appreciate